Imagine being born into a billion-dollar empire, and yet living a life so strange, so chilling, that nearly everyone close to you ends up silenced, missing, or dead. This isn't fiction. This is the story of Robert Durst, a man who slipped through the cracks of justice for decades. But before he was a notorious suspect, before documentaries and trials, there was a young woman named Kathie, and a marriage that ended in mystery. Robert Allen Durst was born in 1943 into one of New York's most powerful families. The Durst organization, skyscrapers, real estate, prestige, it was wealth most people could only imagine. But Robert was never the golden child his father Seymour wanted him to be. He was awkward, distant, and scarred by a childhood trauma few outside the family knew. At just 7 years old, he claimed he witnessed his mother's death as she fell from the roof of their home. That haunting image followed him into adulthood. While his brothers were groomed to inherit the family fortune, Robert seemed restless, eccentric, even unhinged. In the early 1970s, Robert's life seemed to take a brighter turn. He met Kathleen McCormick, Kathie, a bright, ambitious young woman from a modest background. She was studying nursing, later setting her sights on becoming a doctor. To her friends, she was warm, full of life, determined to make her own mark. The two married in 1973, and for a time, it seemed like a fairy tale. The wealthy heir and the hard-working young dreamer. But behind closed doors, cracks appeared. Friends later recalled fights, shouting, and Kathie confiding that Robert could be controlling, even violent. The glamour of the Durst name came with shadows she couldn't ignore. By the late 1970s, Kathie was in medical school, balancing her studies with a crumbling marriage. Robert reportedly resented her independence. Friends remembered her showing up with bruises, whispering that she didn't feel safe, yet she stayed, torn between love, fear, and the hope things might change. Robert's behavior grew stranger. He disappeared for days. He grew obsessed with control. And by 1982, the tension between them had reached a breaking point. Kathie confided to her friends that she wanted out: divorce, freedom, and a life away from Robert. On the evening of January 31st, 1982, Kathie attended a party at a friend's home. Guests later described her as upset, shaken. She confided that Robert had hurt her earlier that evening, but insisted she needed to go back home. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Robert would later tell police he dropped her at a train station in Westchester, where she planned to head back to their Manhattan apartment. But Kathie never arrived. She vanished into the night, leaving no trace. The disappearance stunned her friends, who immediately suspected Robert. To them, it was unthinkable that Kathie, just months from finishing medical school, full of plans for her future, would simply walk away. But Robert, calm and calculated, stuck to his story. No body, no evidence, no crime. At least not yet. A young woman with everything to live for, gone without a trace. A wealthy husband with secrets, insisting he knows nothing. Was Kathie Durst simply missing? Or had the heir to one of New York's most powerful fortunes committed the ultimate betrayal? This was only the beginning, and soon, the cracks in Robert Durst's world would begin to spread. When Kathie vanished in the winter of 1982, the investigation should have been swift, aggressive, unrelenting. A young woman disappears, her husband admits she never made it home. The alarm bells were deafening. But instead of urgency, what followed was hesitation, excuses, and a silence that would echo for decades. Friends of Kathie called the police immediately, desperate to find her. They knew she wouldn't just vanish. She was weeks away from completing medical school, a milestone she had fought hard for. But the initial response from law enforcement was lukewarm at best. Detectives noted Robert's story, and without evidence of foul play, the case was logged as a missing person. Crucial hours slipped by. Search efforts were minimal. It was as if Kathie had simply walked out of her life, leaving friends and family bewildered. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated that Robert's last name, Durst, carried weight. The Durst organization was one of the most powerful real estate dynasties in New York. Did his family's influence encourage authorities to tread lightly? While Kathie's friends scrambled for answers, Robert displayed a chilling calm. He offered conflicting timelines. In one version, he last saw her boarding the train. In another, she had already made it to Manhattan. Later, he admitted he had lied about calling her from the city. When asked for cooperation, he refused to take a polygraph test. He quickly hired lawyers, and within days of her disappearance, he emptied their shared bank account, disposing of her belongings as if she were never coming back. To investigators, he was evasive. To Kathie's loved ones, he was cold. And to the media, he was simply the missing woman's wealthy husband. One of the most striking features of Kathie's disappearance was the quiet surrounding the Durst family. With billions in assets and powerful connections, they stood firmly behind Robert. Not once did they speak publicly about Kathie. Not once did they call for her return. Instead, the family shielded their heir. Wealth and influence acted like armor, creating a wall between Robert and accountability. For Kathie's friends, it was infuriating. A battle of ordinary voices against untouchable power. Amid the silence, one figure stood out: Susan Berman. A writer and journalist from Los Angeles, Susan was one of Robert's closest friends. She knew his secrets, understood his eccentricities, and, according to some, helped him craft the narrative around Kathie's disappearance. Susan became his unofficial spokesperson, defending him, deflecting suspicion, and giving interviews that painted Kathie as troubled. For Robert, she was loyal to the end. For investigators, she would later become a pivotal link, a friend who knew too much. Months turned into years. Kathie's case grew colder with each passing day. Without a body, without solid evidence, police had little to work with. Her friends never stopped pushing, but their voices were drowned out by time, bureaucracy, and Robert's unyielding denials. The official record reduced her to a statistic: a missing woman, last seen on a January night. But behind that record was a haunting truth her loved ones couldn't shake. Robert knew more than he would ever admit. The trail of Kathleen McCormick Durst had gone cold, buried under decades of silence and unanswered questions. But Robert Durst's story was far from over. 18 years later, another body would fall, and this time, the silence surrounding him would begin to crack. For nearly 2 decades, Kathie's disappearance sat in the shadows. Robert Durst lived freely, untouched by the law, protected by wealth and silence. But in December of 2000, the past caught up with him, and it came in the form of a body on the floor in Los Angeles. On December 24, 2000, police entered the modest Benedict Canyon home of Susan Berman. What they found was chilling. Susan shot once in the back of the head, execution style. No forced entry, no sign of robbery. Whoever killed her was someone she trusted. Susan had been Robert's confidant for decades. She had defended him tirelessly after Kathie's disappearance, even speaking to journalists on his behalf. But just as New York investigators were preparing to reopen Kathie's case, Susan was suddenly silenced. Detectives quietly suspected Robert. He had both motive and opportunity. If Susan was about to reveal what she knew, silencing her would keep the secret buried forever. Shortly after Susan's murder, Robert vanished, where he resurfaced stunned even those who knew his eccentric ways. Galveston, Texas. In a rundown apartment, neighbors knew him only as Dorothy Heir, a mute woman in a wig and cheap clothes. Robert had disguised himself as someone unrecognizable, living alone in near squalor despite having access to millions. Why would a wealthy heir choose to live this way? To disappear, investigators later argued. To vanish in plain sight. It wasn't long before another tragedy unfolded. In September 2001, fishermen in Galveston Bay discovered black garbage bags floating on the water. Inside were body parts, dismembered with precision. The victim was Morris Black, Robert's reclusive neighbor. Police traced the bags back to the apartment Robert had rented. Inside, they found a bone saw, blood evidence, and signs of a violent struggle. When confronted, Robert admitted the unthinkable. Yes, he had killed Morris Black. Yes, he had cut up his body. But no, he insisted it wasn't murder. According to Robert, Morris had pulled a gun on him, and the shooting was self-defense. The dismemberment? A panicked attempt to cover his tracks. The case went to trial in 2003, and the world watched in disbelief. On the stand, Robert calmly described sawing through bones, bagging up the remains, and tossing them into the bay. It was grotesque, horrifying, and yet, his defense team spun it into a narrative of panic rather than malice. The jury, to everyone's shock, acquitted him of murder. They convicted him only of tampering with evidence and bail jumping. A man who admitted to dismembering his neighbor walked free. For detectives in both New York and Los Angeles, the acquittal was devastating. They were convinced Morris Black's death, Susan Berman's murder, and Kathie's disappearance were pieces of the same puzzle. But each case seemed to collapse under the weight of missing evidence, clever lawyering, and Robert's sheer audacity. Still, one thing was clear. The bodies were piling up, and the circle around Robert Durst was growing smaller. 3 lives, 3 tragedies, and still Robert Durst walked free. But his greatest undoing wasn't the police, the courts, or the prosecutors. It was his own words, captured on camera, for the world to hear. Robert Durst had slipped through the cracks of justice. He was the man who could dismember a body, walk free from trial, and vanish behind wigs and fake names. But in 2010, the cameras turned on him, and for once, he couldn't control the story. In 2010, documentary filmmakers Andrew Uretsky and Mark Smerling, the team behind Capturing the Friedmans, set out to tell Robert Durst's story. Their fascination began years earlier with a fictionalized film, All Good Things, 2010. Inspired by Durst's life, to their surprise, Robert himself reached out afterward, offering to sit down for interviews. It was the kind of opportunity no filmmaker could refuse. A wealthy heir accused in 3 separate deaths, willing to speak on camera. What followed became HBO's 6-part series, The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, which aired in 2015. The series meticulously pieced together decades of suspicion. From Kathie's disappearance in 1982, to Susan Berman's murder in 2000, to Morris Black's dismemberment in 2001. Each episode painted a portrait of a man who seemed to glide past accountability. But The Jinx went further than any previous coverage. Uretsky and his team obtained new evidence that prosecutors had overlooked or dismissed. The breakthrough came from a simple letter. Back in December 2000, Beverly Hills police received an anonymous note directing them to Susan Berman's house. The block letters on the envelope contained a glaring misspelling, Beverly Hills with an extra E. Years later, while reviewing Robert's personal papers, the filmmakers uncovered another letter he had written to Susan Berman years before her death. The handwriting was eerily similar, and the same misspelling appeared, Beverly. When shown side by side, the resemblance was undeniable. Investigators had missed it. The filmmakers had not. Throughout the series, Robert appeared calm, even smug. He smiled, deflected, and often seemed to revel in the attention. But cracks began to show. In the final interview, Uretsky confronted him with the 2 letters. For once, Robert seemed rattled. His eyes darted. His answers faltered. He insisted they looked very similar, but denied writing the note that led police to Susan's body. The interview ended. Robert retreated to the bathroom, unaware that his microphone was still live. What followed became one of the most chilling moments ever broadcast on television. There it is. You're caught. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course. The words tumbled out as Robert muttered to himself in the bathroom, unaware the cameras were still rolling. The moment was explosive. To some, it was a confession. To others, it was the rambling of an eccentric man talking to himself. HBO carefully edited the audio for dramatic effect, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the words. When The Jinx finale aired on March 15, 2015, viewers across America were stunned. Social media exploded. For the first time in decades, Robert Durst wasn't just a name in legal filings. He was a household name, his face plastered on every news broadcast. Critics debated whether the filmmakers had crossed ethical lines. Did they hold back evidence for dramatic timing? Should they have turned it over to police sooner? But one fact was undeniable. Robert Durst had once again become the center of a murder investigation. Only this time, he wouldn't be able to slip away so easily. The world had heard Robert Durst whisper the unthinkable. But could his words finally be enough to bring him down? The answer would come just one day before the finale aired, when the FBI knocked on his door. For decades, Robert Durst had eluded justice. But in March 2015, just one day before the Jinx finale aired, the knock he had always feared finally came. On March 14, 2015, FBI agents arrested Robert Durst at a Marriott hotel in New Orleans. He was found with a fake ID, a stash of cash, and a revolver. Prosecutors would later argue he was preparing to flee, anticipating the storm that the Jinx was about to unleash. The timing was uncanny. Millions would watch him seemingly confess on HBO the very next night, unaware that the man himself was already behind bars. For years, Susan's murder had been unsolved. But the letter evidence and renewed public attention gave prosecutors a case they could finally push forward. In 2018, Robert was formally ordered to stand trial for Susan Berman's execution-style killing in Los Angeles. The COVID-19 pandemic delayed proceedings, but in May 2021, the trial finally began. Jurors listened to weeks of testimony. They heard about Susan's loyalty to Robert, the financial support she received from him, and the suspicion that she knew too much about Kathie's disappearance. Prosecutors argued that Robert killed Susan to silence her, that she was about to talk to investigators. The defense painted Robert as a sickly, frail old man, incapable of pulling the trigger. But the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. On September 17, 2021, the verdict was read. Robert Durst was guilty of first-degree murder. Justice for Kathie had been elusive for nearly 4 decades. Her family had fought tirelessly to keep her case alive, even as Robert evaded charges. Then, just weeks after his conviction for Susan's murder, the Westchester County District Attorney's Office finally brought the charge Kathie's loved ones had long awaited. Robert Durst was indicted for her 1982 murder. The indictment was historic. After nearly 40 years of whispers, cover-ups, and unanswered questions, prosecutors were ready to officially accuse Robert Durst of killing his wife. But he would never stand trial. In October 2021, Durst was sentenced to life in prison without parole for Susan Berman's murder. He appeared frail in a wheelchair, his health visibly failing. Just months later, on January 10, 2022, Robert Durst died in custody at the age of 78. For many, it felt like a hollow ending. He had finally been convicted, but death arrived before he could answer for Kathie's disappearance in court. Robert Durst's story remains one of the most haunting in American true crime history. He was a man shielded by immense wealth, a powerful family name, and systemic failures in the justice system. For decades, he danced between suspicion and freedom, protected by privilege and his own bizarre cunning. But his downfall revealed something deeper, the persistence of those who refused to let his victims be forgotten. From Kathie's family to Susan's friends, to journalists, detectives, and even documentary filmmakers, the pressure never stopped. Robert Durst died a convicted murderer, but questions still linger. Did he truly kill Kathie? What secrets did Susan Berman take to her grave? And how many times did wealth and power let him walk free before fate finally caught up? Drop your thoughts on the comments. And in the end, Robert Durst's life was not just the story of a man, but a chilling reminder of how easily justice can be delayed, and how hard the truth fights to break through. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe to True Crime Secrets for more true crime stories like this.